It's October, the nights are drawing in, and everything is starting to feel just a bit more spooky. But why are we so fascinated with stories of the strange and uncanny? And, if like me, you're suspicious of the paranormal, how do we explain centuries of reports from so many people across the world who claim to have experienced anything from ghosts and hauntings, to UFO sightings, alien abductions, and anything else that goes bump in the night? I'm IFL Science's resident goblin, Dr Russell Moul, and in this episode of The Big Questions, I speak with Chris French, Emeritus Professor of Anomalistic Psychology at Goldsmiths, University London. We explore the psychology underpinning many paranormal experiences and ask the question, is there really something strange going on out there, or is it all just in our heads?
I am Emeritus Professor Chris French. I retired from the psychology department at Goldsmiths, University of London in 2020. And for the last couple of decades while I was there, I was also the head of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit. Anomalistic psychology essentially primarily focuses upon trying to come up with non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences. I mean, in other words, we're typically looking to see if we can explain the kind of weird experiences that people report in terms of known or knowable psychological and physical factors.
Great. This is very much a job you kind of carved out for yourself, isn't it, if I remember right?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, I was very fortunate insofar as once you've landed yourself a permanent academic post, which is increasingly difficult, I appreciate. But once you've done that, as long as the research you're doing is kind of a high enough quality and of interest to enough people, you can more or less follow your own interests. I've always been fascinated by paranormal type claims. I mean, into early adulthood, I was a believer in a lot of this stuff. And it was only kind of back in the early 80s that I realised that there was a different perspective on this stuff, that you could explain a lot of what's going on in terms of various other psychological factors. So the kind of things that we're particularly interested in are things like hallucinatory experiences, the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, false memories, cognitive biases that we all suffer from, but many of them are relevant to explaining why sometimes people might feel that they've had a paranormal experience, but maybe there are alternative, more plausible explanations. And so, yeah, I was in a very fortunate position where I could kind of indulge my interest in that stuff. And as long as I was kind of publishing papers in reasonably respectable scientific journals, you can carry on. I mean, I have to say one of the drawbacks of having an interest in anomalistic psychology is it's not likely to be the kind of area that attracts the most funding. I totally get that. But then again, you don't need a lot of funding to do a lot of the kind of research we were doing. And, I think we've produced some kind of interesting results over the years.
So when we talk about kind of anomalistic experiences and the paranormal, for want of a better word, really, I suppose we're talking about very broad category of things. We have previously spoken about hauntings and experiences with ghosts, but it's not just about ghosts and experiences with the disembodied dead, is it? It is much broader than that.
It's much broader than that. I mean, even kind of trying to define what the word paranormal means, it's one of those kind of slippery concepts that everybody knows what it means until you actually try and provide a precise definition. Now, in very broad terms, parapsychologists tend to have a kind of fairly tight definition of what they mean by paranormal. They would typically say that the stuff they're interested in would fall under the general categories of extrasensory perception, ESP, And that in itself can be subdivided into 3 different aspects. One is telepathy, the alleged ability for direct mind-to-mind contact. One is precognition, the alleged ability to know about future events before they happen, other than just by straightforward reasoning. And a third would be clairvoyance, the alleged ability to pick up information from remote locations. So that's the kind of sensory side of the paranormal. In addition to that, there's the motor side of the paranormal. We're talking here about things like psychokinesis, or sometimes it's referred to as telekinesis. This is the alleged ability to influence the outside world just by the sheer power of thought. So if you could make things levitate, wow, that would be amazing. And the final category, the third category, would be evidence relating to the possibility of life after death, which would include ghosts, but would also include a lot of other things. It would include mediumship, reincarnation claims, and a whole host of other weird phenomena.
Right, yeah. So, very broad.
Having said that, anomalistic psychologists and the mass media have a much looser definition in terms of anything weird and wonderful, essentially. So that would include in some things that wouldn't fall within that stricter definition that the parapsychologists prefer. So that would include things like astrology, the Bermuda Triangle, UFOs, aliens, the abominable snowman, the Loch Ness monster, anything weird and wonderful. Because often the psychology behind a lot of these beliefs and claims is similar from one area to the other.
When you touched upon the kind of aspects of anomalistic psychology when you introduced it, in terms of the mental things that you're expecting to investigate, but are there any particular psychological factors or traits or things that seem to be the most common forms of explanation for people encountering strange, wonderful and weird things?
It varies very much from one type of phenomenon to another. One of our main focuses of interest in recent years has been the phenomenon of sleep paralysis. And that is, in its most basic form, a very common experience. It's as it says on the tin, it's a temporary period of paralysis that is sometimes experienced between sleep and wakefulness. And if that's the version of it that you get, well, it's a bit disconcerting, but it's no big deal. It's just a bit, that was a bit weird, and then you get on with your day. However, it can be associated with other symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying. And the typical list is a very strong sense of presence. You feel as if there's someone or something in the room with you, and often you feel that whatever it is has evil intentions towards you. But you might also actually hallucinate. You might see lights moving around the room, or dark shadows, or monstrous figures. You might feel as if something is pressing on your chest or trying to strangle you or suffocate you. And people report incredibly high levels of fear while all this is going on. And you can imagine, I get sent a lot of first-hand accounts of people's sleep paralysis episodes, and these are people who decided for themselves that they believe it is sleep paralysis, it's not real, it's a hallucination, but the experience is still terrifying because it feels real while it's happening. Now that is a phenomenon which obviously can account for lots of reports of encounters with ghosts and demons and so on. It's also relevant in terms of explaining alien abduction claims. And you find this quite often, that there are kind of particular phenomena that might be interpreted in different ways by different people depending upon what beliefs they're particularly into. So that would be one example. But in other situations, if we're trying to explain why people might believe in, say, precognitive dreams and so on, then we're looking to a different area. We'll be looking really there. I mean, the obvious skeptical counter-explanation for someone who says they've had a dream that foretold a future event is, well, maybe the match was just a coincidence. So you get into the whole psychology of coincidence there, and that brings us on to cognitive biases in terms of our poor intuitive understanding of things like probability. We're not very good at that kind of task, and therefore often we're more impressed by a coincidence than we should be. And we feel, well, it can't just be a coincidence. There must be something else going on there. And so really, for each of these different types of phenomena, you'd actually basically sit down and say, well, what do we know about psychology that might offer some plausible explanation? Now, the other thing that we do is we try to actually produce evidence for our alternative explanations. It's one thing to say that you can explain something in terms of, well, that's just the power of suggestion. You were expecting that candlestick to move during the séance because the medium said it was going to, and that's how you now remember it or how you perceived it at the time. But it's quite another to actually set that situation up under control conditions and show that just the power of suggestion really is enough for people to misremember things, remember things as happening that didn't happen, or even the other way around, and not remembering or noticing things that did happen, and so on. And it turns out, we're all prone to these kind of biases. They're part of our neural makeup. These biases are always going to be there, and therefore reports of paranormal experience and belief in the paranormal is probably always going to be with us, and isn't necessarily always a bad thing.
That's really interesting. We wouldn't really think about it in those terms. Do you have any examples?
I mean, you can think of some obvious examples. If you believe in life after death, you're probably not going to be quite as frightened as at the thought of dying as somebody who doesn't have that hope to turn to. But as a scientist, you're more interested in, well, yes, but is that really the case? Is that the way the universe really works? It's not a question of believing things just because they make you feel good. We're more interested in believing things because they happen to be true.
Sure, and getting a sense of actually what is there and what isn't there, and where are the limits between our fantasies and the reality. I mean, this is something I've been chewing over for a very long time, is how do we square the fact that we are a very, very clever, well-adapted animal, but equally bloody stupid in so many ways, and finding a way of articulating that, because I think a lot of problems rest in the tension between those two.
I think you're quite right, and we seem to be living through a kind of an age of stupidity, certainly on the kind of international political front and the economic and financial front, naming no names.
No, of course. Who needs paranormal when the normal and mundane
Exactly.
is terrifying anyway? This is what has always fascinated me about this subject, is the human propensity to make very strange views or interpretations of reality. I was revisiting your fantastic book, The Science of Weird Shit.
Thank you.
And I was looking through in particular the section on aliens and alien experiences, because again that merges ideas of the sleep paralysis experiences that you just said as a common phenomenon that humans have probably experienced for generations and generations and generations, and those have all been the experience has been shaped by cultural expectations of different haunting entities, ghosts, fairies, demons, vampires, so and now in modern day experiences aliens. But also I noticed your conversation about false memories, and that's an experience that we can also have in not just in terms of alien experiences, but more generally in our lives. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that in particular, false memories.
Well, again, that has been, as I would say, kind of in terms of what we have concentrated mainly on over the last few years, it has been sleep paralysis, false memories, and belief in conspiracies. And there's nice overlaps between all of those different areas. But with respect to false memories, again, there is no one-size-fits-all explanation for all claims of alien abduction. But it is such a rich and complex phenomenon that you're not going to get that kind of single explanation. But a lot of the cases can be explained in terms of a situation where, for whatever reason, the person who's making the claim of alien abduction started off just having a suspicion that maybe they were being abducted by aliens, even though they didn't have any actual memories of it. And that might sound weird. Why on earth would you think that? Well, if you read the ufology literature, not that I'm recommending that you should, but if you do, you'll realise that it's quite commonly believed in those circles that when the aliens abduct you, they are able to wipe your memory for most of the experience. But, they say, there might be some telltale signs. And the telltale signs include things like, have you ever woken up paralysed with a strong sense of presence, or seen weird lights moving around the bedroom, and so on and so forth. In other words, what they're doing is, I would say, they are misinterpreting the symptoms of sleep paralysis, which is a relatively common experience, as being evidence for you've been abducted by aliens. Now, most people, fortunately, will never have a single episode of sleep paralysis. Most people who do will have the milder version. Most people who have the really vivid version will only have it maybe once or twice in their lives. But there's a small percentage of people who have the really vivid version on a regular basis. And those people are likely to think, well, either something weird and supernatural and paranormal is really happening to me, or I'm going crazy. And so when you come across this explanation, apparent explanation, that no, it's not that you were being abducted by aliens, the challenge is then to retrieve those memories. There are other ways that people can get this suspicion that maybe they've been abducted by aliens. Repeated sightings of something up in the sky and you don't know what it is, or missing time experiences, as they're called, where people can't account for a period of some hours, which is really, that shouldn't be a surprise in terms of what we know about memory, but for some people it would be, and particularly if some of this other stuff's going on as well. So if you've got to the point where you are convinced that you have been abducted by aliens even though you can't remember it, the challenge is, well, you now must retrieve those hidden or repressed memories. And so people may then turn to the services of somebody specialising in hypnotic regression, in the mistaken belief that hypnosis provides a kind of magical key for unlocking these hidden memories. Well, it doesn't. It provides the perfect context for the formation of false memories. What'll happen is you go through the hypnotic induction procedure and you end up with what feel like real memories of something that really happened, but actually it's based on your own expectations, fantasy, imagination, bits of things remembered from dreams, from films, from stuff you've read in books, and it's all woven together, and then it feels incredibly real. And now you have the detailed memories of the aliens abducting you, but you didn't necessarily start that way. And one of the interesting things with false memories, as you say, they can occur, and they do occur, in all kinds of contexts for all of us. We've all got false memories in our heads. It's just that for most of us, they're not false memories of being abducted by aliens. But particularly with hypnotic regression, you tend to get what you expected to get. So if you go for hypnotic regression expecting to uncover memories of alien abduction, there's a very good chance that that's what you'll end up with. But if you go expecting to uncover memories of having been Henry VIII or Mary Queen of Scots in a past life, you'll end up with those memories. If you go expecting to uncover memories of having been the victim of satanic ritual abuse, you'll end up with those memories. You get what you expect. And I think there's an important lesson here, because for all of these things, most people would probably reject those memories. If you hear about somebody who's making these claims, you'll probably think, no, I don't think that really happened, because you don't think people really are being abducted by aliens, or that people really can remember past lives and so on. But it's the same techniques that are being used in those situations as are used to, in inverted commas, recover memories of childhood sexual abuse in other contexts. Now, of course, we know that childhood sexual abuse really does occur, so it seems much more plausible that someone might be able to recover long hidden and repressed memories of that kind of abuse. But you should really bear in mind that in the absence of any other evidence, there's no more reason to believe that than there is to believe the alien abduction claims. The thing is, we obviously have to keep at the forefront of our minds that, yes, childhood sexual abuse really does occur, and it really can have traumatic and long-lasting effects. But we also know that sometimes people make such claims on the basis of sincerely believed but false memories. And so, I think that's kind of an example of where there are lessons from within anomalistic psychology, important lessons that kind of have much wider implications that go way, way beyond the science of weird shit, so to speak.
Yeah, and I mean that's where this is so interesting, because obviously the paranormal captures everybody's imagination, but actually at the end of the day, what you're explaining is very human, broader experiences of reality.
Absolutely.
We know that there were cases, weren't there? And I think this is me pulling it from my deep memory, and it might be a false memory on my part, but there were legal cases, I think in America, where regression was used, and it did lead to false accusations and false claims because of false memories, which then later turned out to, much later down the line, turned out to be false, but actually involved people being prosecuted.
People ended up in prison, serving long prison sentences, families being torn apart, a kind of widespread and unfounded fear that there was that satanic abuse was common, and so on and so forth. And the worry is that these kind of ideas are still there. I mean, you look at the QAnon conspiracy believers these days, and an important part of their belief system is that this satanic abuse is still going on, that, kids are still being kind of sacrificed by powerful people who happen to be practicing Satanists. There's no forensic evidence, physical forensic evidence to support any of these kind of claims. And when you think about what is claimed to be going on, there'd be plenty of physical forensic evidence. There'd be quite a lot of bodily fluids and yet strangely no forensic evidence whatsoever supports these claims.
No. Well, I mean, that perfectly brings me into the next question, which was going to be that you said that your anomalistic research that you've done recently is sleep paralysis, false memories, and also conspiracy theories. And I was going to ask, how does one bring the conspiracy theory into this realm? I can see several trails which would be accessible, but how for an audience who might not be so familiar?
It's one of those topics that initially you think of as just being kind of tangentially related to anomalistic psychology, because clearly not all conspiracy theories have a paranormal element. Some of them do. I mean, if we go back to the alien abduction claims, it's typically claimed that when the aliens abduct people, they communicate with them telepathically and so on. So, there are some that do have that paranormal element. There's also a lot of evidence to show that the tendency to believe in unfounded conspiracies correlates with paranormal belief, and a lot of the same cognitive biases seem to be involved in both aspects of belief. So particularly, one particularly relevant one is, we are as a species so successful because we're really, really good at spotting meaningful patterns in what's going on around us. And that's obviously essential for our survival in terms of our history, being able to recognize the change of the seasons, to be able to see signs of where predators might be around, etc., etc. There's so many examples. However, we sometimes overplay that. We sometimes think we've seen meaningful patterns in what's going on around us, when in fact we haven't. We're basically making the error of thinking there is maybe, typically you'll be talking in terms of a potential threat out there, when really there isn't one. And there are a number of other relevant cognitive biases that we all have. Another one would be what's sometimes called intentionality, sometimes called agenticity. This is the basic tendency that we have, that when something happens in the world around us, our default is to assume that someone or something made that happen with specific intentions towards us. Now, in both of those cases, they are things that from an evolutionary point of view help to keep us alive. Evolution is all about keeping us alive long enough to pass on our genes to the next generation. It's not about giving us brains that help us to apprehend the truth with a capital T about the way the universe works. And so really, we've ended up with these cognitive biases, essentially. And you can think of this in the framework of Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, that sometimes people talk about system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1 thinking is very, very fast. It's effortless. We're not consciously aware of it. It's what you might loosely refer to as intuition. And we rely on it a lot more, even those of us who like to think that we're very, very reasonable, rational people, but we rely on system one thinking a lot more than we appreciate. System one is driven by emotion. It's, as I say, it's got all these different characteristics. A typical example would be being introduced to somebody for the first time and deciding very, very quickly whether you like them or not. And it's not based on a kind of rational assessment of that person. It's just a feeling. It's your intuition. In contrast to that, we have system two thinking, which is much slower. It's serial processing. It's rational step by step. We're consciously aware of it. It's effortful. So if I give you a mental puzzle to solve, you'll be aware of kind of the different steps, trying different things in your head and so on and so forth. So that would be a kind of prime example of system two type thinking. And as I said, it turns out that we're much more influenced by this quick and dirty system one thinking. It's based on heuristics rather, not always going to deliver the right answer, but it does most of the time. And in terms of our evolutionary history, it makes much more sense to rely on a system that is very quick and usually right, rather than a system which is much slower and maybe right a little bit more often. So it's that kind of cost-benefit analysis that we have to think about. So everybody gives the same example, so I will do the same thing. You've got the Stone Age man, something rustling in the bushes. Is it a saber-toothed tiger or not? Well, the guy who depends on system one thinking and just gets the hell out of there will live to pass on his genes to the next generation. And if he was wrong, well, so what? It doesn't cost him much to make that error. If his next cave neighbour, who is kind of much more rational, stands there scratching his beard and thinking, I wonder if that really is a saber-toothed tiger, well, he may well end up as lunch. So our brains have evolved in such a way that we tend to make the error, we're more likely to make the error of thinking there is a potential threat out there than, even when there isn't, then actually kind of missing a threat that really is out there. And I say, so that explains why, you might think, first thinking about it, well, surely these kind of cognitive biases that lead us to make these mistakes, why haven't they just evolved out? Why hasn't natural selection got rid of them? Well, it's because of this balance between speed and accuracy that's the important thing in terms of keeping us alive.
Yeah. And so that feeds into, as you said, a kind of a sense of agency. It also helps explain, I suppose, if, for instance, right now, we touched on the fact that we're in a bit of a politically interesting time, but we were also seeing the rise of multiple conspiracies. World conspiracy, you mentioned QAnon, which is still shifting and changing and existing, but it adds agency and explanation to the shitification of the world around us.
Exactly.
It blames somebody. So I suppose there's also the element that it makes the world make sense as well and adds a bit more flair to otherwise mundane experiences.
That's right. Yeah.
It's difficult just to say that the world's crap because we're not brilliant agents of our own destinies, and that the systems of power are also vulnerable to the same levels of rubbishness that we have on a daily basis.
Well, this is it. I mean, again, the people who've really kind of looked into belief in conspiracies, one of the important factors is, as you say, trying to make sense of the world. I mean, in reality, sometimes things just happen out of the blue. Nobody could possibly have seen it coming. But that idea that the universe can be kind of so random and chaotic is quite a scary one. It's almost as if the conspiracy theorists prefer the idea that, well, at least somebody's in control behind the scenes. Even if they're not doing good things, at least they're in control. It's not that kind of chaos. And so, the idea has been put forward, and I think it's reasonably well supported by the evidence that, as I say, this notion of trying to just understand the way the world around you is an important part of belief in conspiracies. But it's, in actual fact, adopting these conspiracy beliefs doesn't really satisfy that demand for many people. They still end up kind of suffering kind of quite high levels of anxiety. The problem is that, as my friend the philosopher Stephen Law describes it, he refers to certain belief systems as being what he calls intellectual black holes. And what he means by that is that once you're on the inside of them, it's very difficult to get out. And conspiracy theories are probably the prime example of that, because once you're inside, then everything can be interpreted within terms of the conspiracy theory. So any evidence that seems to count against the conspiracy theory, well, that's been put there by the conspirators, hasn't it? These are very powerful people. That's misinformation, that's disinformation, that's fake news. And then any evidence, no matter how weak, that supports the conspiracy, yes, we'll grab onto that. And again, this is another cognitive bias, probably the most pervasive and powerful of them all, confirmation bias. We all pay more attention to evidence that supports what we already believe or what we'd like to be true, whereas we either don't even notice evidence that counts against it, or we have kind of what seem to be perfectly reasonable reasons for rejecting it and not accepting it. And we're all prone to these biases. It's not just the people who believe in conspiracies or the paranormal. We're all prone to them, but maybe some people are more prone to them than others.
Sure. Yes. So I suppose this actually, we've talked about, the psychology that underpins paranormal beliefs, but also beliefs in conspiracy theories, and how they have, they're part at the moment of a kind of weird cultural zeitgeist or counterculture or something like that. There's something, we've got going on in the world around us at the moment. To what extent would you say that popular portrayals of the paranormal or the strange are influencing people's wider beliefs? Do you see an impact from like media and, in the form of journalists and the news agencies, or films and other things impacting this?
There is definitely influence, and I think it's a kind of reciprocal relationship. There have been times in the past, and maybe to some extent even these days, where I might be contacted by a journalist who will say, what are the explanations behind this kind of sudden rise in paranormal belief? And I'll say, well, what evidence have you got that there has been a sudden rise in paranormal belief? And really you need to look at survey data. That's probably your best form of evidence in terms of being able to assess that. And yes, there are fluctuations, and they do sometimes follow what's happening in the media, but sometimes it's just that the media have picked up on the fact that there is an appetite for stuff out there, and they'll start feeding that appetite, and then maybe there'll be an increase and so on. So it's actually usually much more kind of complicated than just a one-directional relationship. I mean, for example, when Close Encounters of the Third Kind was released, suddenly there were a lot more reports of UFOs. That might just reflect the fact that now more people are kind of looking up in the night sky and seeing things that they don't know what they are. But, there's also that kind of general interest that's generated. And there were a couple of best-selling books at the end of the 80s about alien abduction, and suddenly rates of reported alien abduction go through the roof and so on. But sometimes, as I say, it can be the case that the media will kind of pick up on stuff that was already there. And really, if you look at the statistics on these things, yes, there are some fluctuations, and there's some evidence that sometimes these things, something might be in fashion. I mean, at the moment in the UK, it seems to be a kind of ghosts seem to be the big thing. But a couple of decades back, they weren't so big. It was alien abductions were the big thing, and then, I mean, for me, as a card-carrying skeptic, obviously, and somebody who kind of does podcasts and writes books about this stuff, and does TV interviews and so on, it's kind of in my interest that there is so much interest in all this stuff. But sometimes when I'm taking part in various kind of I've taken part in some really, really dreadful TV series, and there's a part of me that kind of thinks, well, should I really be doing this? Is this kind of giving greater respectability to some of these kinds of topics than maybe they really deserve? My reasons for doing it are kind of, first off, it's interesting. It's interesting in terms of the lay psychology of what's going on, to go into these houses and where people believe that the house is really haunted, and to talk to them and to find out why they think that is the case. Secondly, it's kind of quite fun. It really is. It's different. It's and thirdly, if I don't do it, somebody else will, who may may not actually have as much knowledge about these things as me. And then finally, yes, I admit it, they pay me, so I can't pretend that is not a factor. But it is an issue for kind of skeptics. There are some kind of purists who say, no, I'll never take part in those programs precisely because it is kind of making it look like, this is a serious question. But I mean, also, I think I'm probably, the skepticism is a kind of wide church, and I'm probably a bit more tolerant and kind of open-minded to the possibility that I might be wrong. Maybe some of these things will really turn out to... Maybe some paranormal phenomena will turn out to be genuinely beyond explanation in terms of conventional science. I'm not holding my breath, but, I think it's important and a really important part of skepticism for me is to be open to the possibility that you might be wrong. There might be some evidence that comes along that makes you change your mind. Science has been wrong in the past. It will be wrong in the future. I happen to think it's the best method that we have for trying to approach the truth. But at the very heart of science is skepticism, open-minded skepticism.
I think that's possibly a problem with the common use of the word skepticism. That skepticism automatically conjures in most people's minds that you're going to be a closed-minded person.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I edited the Skeptic magazine for 10 years, and we're a constant discussion about should we change the title. It sounds so negative, I currently run Greenwich Skeptics in the Pub. And we have a great time, but it's not the kind of mental image that it summons up for me. When I hear skeptics in the pub, I think of, 3 grumpy old men sitting round a table with pints of warm bitter, all saying, "Oh, I don't believe in that, do you?" It's that kind of, No, it's not like that at all. And the other thing, this notion of open-mindedness, and again, I think you'll be aware of this, that I can say to people say to me, what would make you change your mind? Well, I can say, well, if we set up this experiment on telepathy and we got results that were this high on this test, I would, if that, and we could do that repeatedly, well, I'd have to acknowledge that, yes, telepathy is real, What would make you change your mind? Talking to the believers, and typically the believers, there's nothing that could make them change their mind. They know they're right, and that's absolute certainty. And again, science isn't about certainty. It's always about our best guess on the basis of the currently available evidence, but that might change.
Mm-hmm. A very actual humble view on our personal experience and engagement with the world.
I think that's right, yeah. I mean, we at the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit, over the years, we put an awful lot of effort, even though it wasn't the main focus of our work, into actually directly testing paranormal claims. And we would design these tests with the claimants, we'd make sure they agreed it was a fair test of their claims. Typically, we would get them to sign something in advance to that effect. We'd then run the test, they'd fail the test, and then they would decide it wasn't a fair test after all. What more can we do? We were putting our beliefs, laying them on the line. Could have ended up with results that would have shown that our skepticism was misplaced, but it's never happened. And like I say, we've done dozens and dozens of such tests over the years.
No, that's fair enough. So I suppose the last question I need to ask is really the big question: is it all in our heads?
I think it probably is. But again, I say probably because I'm open to the possibility that I might be wrong. One of the big differences between people who would self-identify as skeptics and people who would who wouldn't or would even self-identify as believers is it's about the kind of standard of evidence that you're talking about. I'll sometimes hear skeptics saying there's no evidence for telepathy. Well, that's nonsense. There is evidence. It's the quality of the evidence and how you interpret the evidence. That's where the interesting debate lies. And I've said this before, and I'll no doubt say it again, but all sciences are about trying to separate the signal from the noise. And I've kind of, over the years, kind of increasingly asked the question, well, what would a science look like if all you had was noise? And I think it would probably look very much like parapsychology. And so, the thing is, logically, you can never prove that ESP doesn't exist. It may be just that we've not been looking in the right place or doing it in the right way, or, so far. Maybe it's just around the next corner. But potentially you could prove that it does exist. That is something that is potentially provable if it really does exist. Well, so far, the wider scientific community, including myself, are not satisfied that really good, convincing evidence is there. Maybe it'll come along in the future. But like I say, I suspect that if it's right to say that maybe it isn't there, the attempts to try and find it will carry on forever. Whereas we're never going to get to a situation where the skeptics can say, right, that's it, we've proved it doesn't exist, move on, do something else. That's never going to happen.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time and wonderful insights into so many wonderful, amazing, fun things.
Thank you, Russell. And you. Take care.
The music in this episode is credited to Audioblocks.